This is a story of destruction and rebuilding, with the U.S. responsible for the former and China for the latter. After more than a decade of war, Iraq is now returning to a state of calm and beginning to rebuild the country. Iraq has signed a contract with two Chinese companies to construct 1,000 schools in its capital, Baghdad, and other areas. These 1,000 schools are expected to be completed within 2 years. Iraqi officials have stated that a total of 8,000 schools need to be built in Iraq to address gaps in education. The first phase of this massive rebuilding project in Iraq involves the construction of the initial 1,000 schools, which will be carried out by China Energy Engineering Group and Sinotech. This is part of the Cooperation Framework Agreement between the Chinese and Iraqi governments. The first phase includes the construction of 1,000 schools. The second phase is expected to build 3,000 schools, and the final phase will build 4,000 schools. Iraq was once a prosperous country, having benefited from the enormous profits gained from oil development since the 1970s. Iraq achieved a high level of economic development, much like today's Gulf countries. However, under the rule of Saddam Hussein, Iraq became embroiled in the Iran-Iraq War and the Gulf War. The long-term war and economic sanctions dealt a heavy blow to Iraq's economy. In 2003, the United States launched the Iraq War, claiming that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. The war lasted for weeks and resulted in the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist regime. Although the Americans toppled a tyrant, they did not find any evidence to support their claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. However, the Americans, Iraq's new ruler, did not bring peace and development to the country. Under American rule, Iraq became divided and turned into a breeding ground for terrorism. The war with Saddam Hussein's remnants and the terrorists did not end until 2011. After a brief period of calm, Iraq was plunged into chaos once again in 2014, when the Islamic State terrorists swept across the country. It took several years of intense fighting to defeat them, but many parts of Iraq still remain in conflict to this day. Over 4 decades of war have forced many children to abandon their education. This has been a huge loss for Iraq, resulting not only in a lower average education level for young Iraqis, but also leaving many of these young people vulnerable to extremist ideologies, which could lead to even more devastating consequences, plunging the country into prolonged crisis. By the end of 2021, most of the U.S. troops have been withdrawn from Iraq, and peace has finally been restored to the country. With the reduction in military spending and the cost of serving their American boss, the Iraqi government can finally focus on large-scale reconstruction efforts. The first step in the reconstruction plan is to restore the country's education system to a level that meets the needs of its people. With 16 million children and youth under the age of 14 in Iraq, 40 years of war have left many schools in ruins, forcing students to cram into overcrowded classrooms or to abandon their studies altogether. The Iraqi government's plan to build 8,000 schools is expected to meet the needs of 5 million students. The construction of the first phase of 1,000 schools alone will provide a better learning environment for 500,000 children and enable them to return to school. Undoubtedly, this is a great project. Iraqi cabinet officials have stated that the school project is the most significant livelihood project with strategic significance for the Iraqi government, and is currently the highest priority and most important project. However, even for a small part of the 8,000 schools, which is the 1,000 schools, the funds needed for this plan are enormous, and the construction process is very difficult. The huge difficulties faced by the project are the reasons why Iraq chose to cooperate with China to build schools. Specifically, there are several main reasons. Firstly, China attaches great importance to its friendship with Iraq, and Chinese companies offer Iraq very favorable prices, under the instructions of Chinese President Xi Jinping. Secondly, the construction quality of Chinese companies is very good, which is essential for schools. Thirdly, Chinese companies can complete the project on time, as building schools is very urgent for Iraq. In addition to considering the engineering and construction aspects, Iraq has received billions of dollars in investment from China in the Belt and Road Initiative, which has saved Iraq a lot of money and brought good returns, enabling them to have more funds to invest in education. Now, most of the first batch of 1,000 schools is under construction, and these schools will be completed between 2023 and 2025, enabling more Iraqi children and adolescents to have a better campus life. Iraq once had the best education system in the Middle East, but it was heavily damaged during the U.S. occupation. While the U.S. focused on destruction, China's approach is characterized by construction, highlighting a major difference between the two countries. Over 2 decades, the U.S. spent $3 trillion on war in Iraq, yet chose not to rebuild any schools for the Iraqis. Instead, they spent a fortune transforming the Green Zone in central Baghdad into a secure fortress. In contrast, China prioritizes economic cooperation and development, investing in building schools and infrastructure to improve people's lives. Investing in schools is much more effective than buying tanks, as poverty and hunger are the root causes of terrorism. Only economic development can bring lasting peace to a nation.